And now we're just going to go and launch into our readings. I'm not going to introduce people. I'll tell you who their names as they come up, but the descriptions are in your program, so we can go directly to readings. And we're going to start with Meena Alexander reading from the autobiographical.
It's really a great honor to be here at this festival celebrating Baldwin. And it was a great thrill for me, actually, to know that I could come to this. I first read James Baldwin's work, autobiographical notes, Fire Next Time, and so on, in Africa. I'm from India, but I went with my family to North Africa, and I was in Khartoum, in Sudan. And this copy of Baldwin was brought to us by a young African-American woman who was exploring the continent. She'd come from the United States, and she told us about red velvet cake and Superman and James Baldwin. And I remember when I cracked open this book, it was as if I'd received a shot in my veins of something that was terrible and beautiful and quite dark and difficult. And yet I knew that I had to understand this if I was really going to be a writer, if I wanted to be the poet and the writer that I was hoping to be. So I will read these pages from the autobiographical notes of James Baldwin, which I first read, I think, at the age of 15. I know in any case that the most crucial time in my own development came when I was forced to recognize that I was a kind of bastard in the West. When I followed the line of my past, I did not find myself in Europe, but in Africa. And this meant that in some subtle way, in a really profound way, I brought to Shakespeare, Bach, Rembrandt, and to the stones of Paris, to the cathedral at Chartres, and to the Empire State Building, a special attitude. These were not really my creations. They did not contain my history. I might search in them in vain forever for any reflection of myself. I was an interloper, and this was not my heritage. At the same time, I had no other heritage which I could possibly hope to use. I had certainly been unfitted for the jungle or the tribe. I would have to appropriate these white centuries. I would have to make them mine. I would have to accept my special attitude, my special place in this scheme. Otherwise, I would have no place in any scheme. What was the most difficult was the fact that I was forced to admit something I had always hidden from myself, which the American Negro has had to hide from himself as the price of his public progress, that I hated and feared white people. This did not mean that I loved black people. On the contrary, I despised them, possibly because they had failed to produce a Rembrandt. In effect, I hated and feared the world. And this meant not only that I thus gave the world an altogether murderous power over me, but also that in such a self-destroying limbo, I could never hope to write. One writes out of one thing only, one's own experience. Everything depends on how relentlessly one forces from this experience the last drop, sweet or bitter, it can possibly give. This is the only real concern of the artist, to recreate out of the disorder of life that order which is art. The difficulty then for me of being a Negro writer was the fact that I was, in effect, prohibited from examining my own experience too closely. by the tremendous demands and the very real dangers of my social situation. I don't think the dilemma outlined above is uncommon. I do think, since writers work in the disastrously explicit medium of language, that it goes a little way towards explaining why, out of the enormous resources of Negro speech and life, and despite the example of Negro music, prose written by Negroes has been, generally speaking, so pallid and so harsh. I have not written about being a Negro at such length because I expect that to be my only subject, but because it was the gate I had to unlock before I could hope to write anything else. I don't think that the Negro problem in America can even be discussed coherently without bearing in mind its context being the history, traditions, customs, the moral assumptions and preoccupations of this country. In short, the general social fabric. Appearances to the contrary, no one in America escapes its effects. And everyone in America bears some responsibility for it. I believe this the more firmly because it has the overwhelming tendency to speak of this problem as though it were a thing apart. But in the work of Faulkner, in the general attitude and certain specific passages, in Robert Penn Warren, and most significantly, in the advent of Ralph Ellison, one sees the beginnings, at least, of a most genuinely penetrating search. Mr. Ellison, by the way, is the first Negro novelist I have ever read to utilize in language, and brilliantly, something of the ambiguity and irony of Negro life. About my interests, I don't know if I have any, unless the morbid desire to own a 16mm camera and make experimental movies can be so classified. Otherwise, I love to eat and drink. It's my melancholy conviction that I've scarcely ever had enough to eat. This is because it is impossible to eat enough if you're worried about the next meal. And I love to argue with people who do not disagree with me too profoundly. And I love to laugh. I do not like bohemia or bohemians. I do not like people whose principal aim is pleasure. And I do not like people who are earnest about anything. I don't like people who like me because I'm a Negro. Neither do I like people who find in the same accidental grounds contempt for contempt. I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. I think all theories are suspect, that even the finest principles may have to be modified or may even be pulverized by the demands of life, and that one must find, therefore, one's own moral center and move through the world hoping that the center will guide one aright. I consider that I have many responsibilities, but none greater than this, to last, as Hemingway says, and get my work done. I want to be an honest man and a good writer.
Okay. One of the great excitements of the festival for me is to have discovered, for one thing, that right around the block here on 18th Street is the James Baldwin School, the high school, public school here in New York. And we are going to have readers from the school each day, and starting with you. Introduce yourself.
Okay. I am Michelle Lyles, and I go to the James Baldwin High School. I'm going to read, I wanted to read this letter from the fire next time, because the first time I read it, I cried because it actually, I felt like I could relate to it, though this book wasn't, written recently. And I felt that it was so sad that I actually still could feel the way James Baldwin felt. Yeah, so I'm just going to get right into it. Okay. I have begun this letter 5 times and torn it up 5 times. I keep seeing your face, which is also the face of your father and my brother. Like him, you are tough, dark, vulnerable, moody, with a definite tendency to sound truculent, because you want no one to think you are soft. You may be like your grandfather in this, I don't know. But certainly both you and your father resemble him very much physically. Well, he is dead. He never saw you, and he had a terrible life. He was defeated long before he had died, because at the bottom of his heart, he really believed what the white people said about him. This is one of the reasons that he became so holy. I'm sure your father has told you something about all that. Neither you nor your father inhabit any tendencies towards holiness. You really are of another era. Part of what happened when the Negro left the land and came into what the late E. Franklin Frazier called the cities of destruction. You can only be destroyed by believing you can only be destroyed by believing that you really are what the white world calls a nigger. I tell you this because I love you, and please don't you ever forget it. I have known both of you all your lives, have carried your daddy in my arms and on my shoulders, kissed and spanked him, and watched him learn to walk. I do not know if you know anybody from that far back, if you loved anybody that long, first as an infant, then as a child, then as a man. You gain a strange perspective on time and human pain and effort. Other people cannot see what I see whenever I look into your father's face. Behind your father's face, as it is today, are all those other faces which was his. Let him laugh, and I see the cellar your father does not remember, and the house he does not remember. And I hear in his present laughter, his laughter as a child. Let him curse, and I remember him falling down the cellar steps and howling, and I remember with pain his tears, which my hand or your grandmother's so easily wiped away. But no one's hand could wipe away those tears he shed invisibly today. Which one hears in his laughter and in his speech and in his songs. I know what the world has done to my brother, and how narrowly he has survived it. I know which is much worse, and this is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I, nor time, nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives, and do not know it, and do not want to know it. I can be, indeed one must strive to become tough and philosophical concerning destruction and death, for this is what most of mankind has been best at since we have heard of men. But remember, most of mankind is not all of mankind. But it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes this crime. Now, my dear namesake, these innocent and well-meaning people, your countrymen, have caused you to be born under conditions not very far removed from those described for us by Charles Dickens in London. For more than 100 years ago, I hear the chorus of the innocent screaming, "No, this is not true. How bitter you are." But I am writing this letter to you, to try to tell you something about how to handle them. For most of them do not really know that you exist. I know the conditions under which you were born, for I was there. Your countrymen were not there, and haven't made it yet. Your grandmother also was there, and no one has ever accused her of being bitter. I suggest that the innocents check with her. She isn't hard to find. Your countrymen do not know that she exists either, though she has been working for them all their lives. Well, you were born, here you came, something like 15 years ago, And though your father and mother and grandmother, looking about the streets through which they were carrying you, staring at the walls into which they brought you, had every reason to be heavy-hearted, but yet they were not. For here you were, Big James, named for me. You were a big baby. I was not. Here you were to be loved. To be loved, baby, hard, at once and forever, to strengthen you against the loveless world. Remember that. I know how black it looks today for you. It looked bad that day too. Yes, we were trembling. We have not stopped trembling yet. But if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And now you must survive because we love you. And for the sake of your children and your children's children. This innocent country set you down in a ghetto, in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish. Let me spell out precisely what I mean by that. For the heart of the matter is here, and the root of my dispute with my country. You were born where you were born and faced the future that you would face because you were black, and for no other reason. The limits of your ambition were thus expected to be set forever. You were born into a society which spelled out the beautiful clarity, and in as many ways as possible, that you were a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. Wherever you have turned, James, in this short life on earth, you have been told where to go, what you could do, and how you could do it, and where you could live, and whom you can marry. I know your countrymen do not agree with me about this, and I hear them saying, you exaggerate. They do not know Harlem, and I do. So do you. So take no one's word for anything, including mine, but trust your own experience. Know whence you came. If you know whence you came, there is really no limit where you could go. The details and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed to make you believe what the white people say about you. Please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause to endure, does not testify your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. Please try to be clear. Dear James, through the storm which rages about your useful head today, about the reality that lies behind the word acceptance and integration, there is no reason for you to try to become like the white people, and there is no bias whatever for their impairment assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, oh buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love. For these innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. They have had to believe for many years, for innumerable reasons, that black men are inferior to white men. Many of them indeed know better. But as you will discover, people find it difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and all the stars aflame. You will be frightened because it is out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it is so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality. Well, the black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar. And as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations. You don't be afraid. I said that it was intended that you should perish in the ghetto. Perish by never being allowed to go behind the white man's definition, by never being allowed to spell your proper name. You have, and many of us have, defeated this intention, and by a terrible law, and a terrible paradox, these innocents who believe that your imprisonment made them safe are losing grasp of reality. But these men are your brothers, your lost younger brothers. And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means. That we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. For this is your home, my friend. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here and will again. And we will make America what America must become. It will be hard, James, but you come from sturdy peasant stock, men who picked cotton from dammed rivers and built railroads, and in the teeth of the most terrifying odds, achieved inaccessible and monumental dignity. You come from a long line of great poets, some of the greatest poets since Homer. One of them said, "The very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off." You know, and I know, that the country is celebrating 100 years of freedom, 100 years too soon. We cannot be free. We cannot be free until they are all free. God bless you, James, and Godspeed. Your Uncle James.
She was putting on a great act of being nervous backstage, but she commanded the room. Anyway, let's see. So, Darryl Pinckney, one of our great writers, essayists.
You're going to have to yell when I hit 15 minutes. Yell time at me. James Baldwin understood the church as refuge, but he got out through the circumstances of his will, his gift, his temperament. His refuge did not become his prison, the end of his road as an intelligent black person. Baldwin created choices as a young and single man that took him beyond the slum he'd grown up in, and he kept the love of his family even so. Baldwin had the support of editors, publishers, the occasional foundation, but he was on his own, really, desperately freelance. The University of Massachusetts came toward the end of his career. He lived without institutional protection. He was a writer, but not a professional, no matter how thrilled or relieved he may have been to be Esquire class when it came to the selling of his reportage. The aura of the artist was with him. The distinction is perhaps lost or irrelevant these days, and with it a sense of the price of the genuine. Back then, it meant that he was beyond control, his own jurisdiction. The literary voice of a free black man took so many by surprise. Baldwin had something different to say, something new, or so it seemed to me, even though at the time when I was first reading his essays, many of them were 2 decades old. He sounded like no one else, which is why we react to his prose in a way not unlike our response to composers, with an unmistakable tone. Baldwin went too far, pulling aside the curtain to talk about what was lying around backstage in both the black and white psyche. He discomforted old believers, the generation and the gender that perfected the mask, much evolved since it was called upon to grin and lie. Baldwin dispensed with the mask, particularly that of pride, that fortress masculinity. He understood it, but he could not recommend it, it being much too constrictive for how swiftly he wanted his thoughts to move across the page. For all his keenness of observation and sympathy for the people whose lives he knows or can imagine so well, his was not the voice of a generation. He belonged entirely to himself. Because so many black writers in the past had difficult lives and lapsed into obscurity, we tend to think of African American literature as an avant-garde tradition in America. But Zellner, Hurston, and Langston Hughes were dismayed that they had so little commercial success. In the 1930s, Hughes actually expected the U.S. mainstream to go left politically. Even before the 1960s, Baldwin knew just how uptight the U.S. was as a society, but nevertheless, he tried the rest of his life to reproduce in fiction the winning formula of his sexy bestseller, Another Country. Consequently, he was a freer person in the essay form. His voice never aged, the wise child in the pulpit, the questing youth, the cool cat hanging out in the cafe terrace when all the squares have gone to bed. Yet time has begun to settle over Baldwin's work. He is honest and we trust what he is telling us, but his essays are becoming historical. The Harlem I still think of when I think of Harlem exists more in his writing than it does in the place where I now live. Baldwin's neighborhood went from 130th Street to 135th Street, from Lenox Avenue east 1 block to the Harlem River. In 5th Avenue uptown, an essay collected in Nobody Knows My Name, people and shopkeepers from Baldwin's childhood are still around in 1960, some 30 years later. There is the black shoe repairman and the Jewish grocery store owner, the unemployed with the distant look, the half-abandoned children in the streets. His 5th Avenue is filthy, hostile, the stoops are crumbling. People who get up in the morning and go downtown to meet the man come home and browbeat the landlord into fixing the heat. They have prodigious amounts of patience, he says. On 131st Street, neighbors are still calling to one another, and mothers are telling their sons to come back and close the front door. But Harlem is not a slum anymore. It's not even a ghetto. Baldwin's soda pop joint and his dry cleaners are gone. No new businesses have taken their place. It is a sleepy block. 5th Avenue uptown is a parade of converted brownstones until you get to Baldwin's projects, the Lincoln houses they're called now. Where he used to live got torn down to make room for the projects years ago. When he wrote his essay, the other side of the street had not been rehabilitated, as he phrased it. But since then, the tenements have become an unsuccessful tower and 15 dead, shuttered storefronts in this one-story commercial block meant to provide services. It is here in Baldwin's projects and the way they are policed that we can find his Harlem. And here he might wish us to ask, if times have changed for the brownstones, then why not for the projects nearby and the people who live in them? From 5th Avenue uptown. The projects in Harlem are hated. They are hated almost as much as policemen, and this is saying a great deal. And they are hated for the same reason. Both reveal unbearably the real attitude of the white world, no matter how many liberal speeches are made, no matter how many lofty editorials are written, no matter how many civil rights commissions are set up. The projects are hideous, of course, there being a law apparently respected throughout the world that popular housing shall be as cheerless as a prison. They are lumped all over Harlem, colorless, bleak, high, and revolting. The wide windows look out on Harlem's invincible and indescribable squalor. The Park Avenue Railroad tracks around which about 40 years ago the present dark community began. The unrehabilitated houses bowed down, it would seem, under the great weight of frustration and bitterness they contain. The dark, the ominous schoolhouses from which the child may emerge, maimed, blinded, hooked, or enraged for life. And the churches, block upon block of churches, niched in the walls like cannon in the walls of a fortress. Even if the administration of the projects were not so insanely humiliating, the projects would still be hated because they are an insult to the meanest intelligence. Harlem got its first private project, Riverton, which is now naturally a slum, about 12 years ago because at the time Negroes were not allowed to live in Stuyvesant Town. Harlem watched Riverton go up, therefore, in the most violent bitterness of spirit and hated it long before the builders arrived. They began hating it about the same time people began moving out of their condemned houses to make room for this additional proof of how thoroughly the white world despised them. And they had scarcely moved in naturally before they began smashing windows, defacing walls, urinating in the elevators, and fornicating in the playgrounds. Liberals, both black and white, were appalled at the spectacle. I was appalled by the liberal innocence or cynicism which comes out in practice as much the same thing. Other people were delighted to be able to point to proof positive that nothing could be done to better the lot of the colored people. They were and are right in one respect, that nothing can be done as long as they are treated like colored people. The people in Harlem know they are living there because white people do not think they are good enough to live anywhere else. No amount of improvement can sweeten this fact. Whatever money is now earmarked to improve this or any other ghetto might as well be burnt. A ghetto can be improved in one way only, out of existence. Similarly, the only way to police a ghetto is to be oppressive. None of the police commissioners' men, even with the best will in the world, have any way of understanding the lives led by the people they swagger about in twos and threes controlling. Their very presence is an insult. It would be, even if they spent their entire day feeding gumdrops to children. They represent the force of the white world, and that world's real intentions are simply for that world's criminal profit and ease to keep the black man corralled up here in his place. The badge, the gun in the holster, and the swinging club make vivid what will happen should his rebellion become overt. Rare indeed is the Harlem citizen, from the most circumspect church member to the most shiftless adolescent, who does not have a long tale to tell of police incompetence, injustice, or brutality. I myself have witnessed and endured it more than once. The businessmen and racketeers also have a story, and so do the prostitutes. It is hard, on the other hand, to blame the police, blank, good-natured, thoughtless, and innocent, for being such a perfect representative of the people he serves. He, too, believes in good intentions and is astounded and offended when they are taken for the deed. He has never himself done anything for which to be hated. Which of us has? And yet he is facing daily and nightly people who would gladly see him dead, and he knows it. There is no way for him not to know it. There are few things under heaven more unnerving than the silent, accumulating contempt and hatred of a people. He moves through Harlem, therefore, like an occupying soldier in a bitterly hostile country, which is precisely what and where he is, and is the reason he walks in twos and threes. And he is not the only one who knows why. He is always in company. The people who are watching him know why, too. Any street meeting, sacred or secular, which he and his colleagues uneasily cover, has as its explicit or implicit burden the cruelty and injustice of the white domination. And these days, of course, in terms increasingly vivid and jubilant, it speaks of the end of that domination. The white policeman standing on a Harlem street corner finds himself at the very center of the revolution now occurring in the world. He is not prepared for it, naturally, nobody is. And what is possibly much more to the point, he is exposed, as few white people are, to the anguish of the black people around him. Even if he is gifted with the merest mustard grain of imagination, something must seep in. He cannot avoid observing that some of the children, in spite of their color, remind him of children he has known and loved, perhaps even of his own children. He knows that he certainly does not want his children living this way. He can retreat from his uneasiness in only one direction, into a callousness which very shortly becomes second nature. He becomes more callous, the population becomes more hostile, the situation grows more tense, and the police force is increased. One day, to everyone's astonishment, someone drops a match in the powder keg, and everything blows up. Before the dust has settled or the blood congealed, editorial speeches and civil rights commissioners are loud in the land, demanding to know what happened. What happened is that Negroes want to be treated like men. Thank you.
Now we have Robert Krulwich from NPR and Radiolab, and the awarder every few years of the Bobby, and you can tell us a bit about that too.
The Bobby is an award I give because my name is Robert to things that I liked in the year that I read them or encountered them. And James Baldwin won his Bobby in about 1962, I think. And then again, and every time I read this story, again. So it is called Sonny's Blues, and I only read a bit about, this is how it begins. I read about it in the paper in the subway on my way to work. I read it, and I couldn't believe it, and I read it again. Then perhaps I just stared at it at the newsprint, spelling out his name, spelling out the story. I stared at it in the swinging lights of the subway car and in the faces of the bodies of the people and my own face trapped in the darkness which roared outside. It was not to be believed, and I kept telling myself that as I walked from the subway station to the high school, at the time I just couldn't doubt it, though. I was scared for Sonny. He'd become real to me again. A great block of ice got settled in my belly and kept melting there slowly all day long while I taught my classes algebra. It was a special kind of ice. It kept melting, sending trickles of ice water up and down my veins, but it never got less. Sometimes it hardened, seemed to expand until I felt my guts were going to come spilling out, that I was going to choke or scream. This would always be at a moment when I was remembering some specific thing Sonny had once said or done. When he was about as old as the boys in my classes, his face had been bright and open, and there was a lot of copper in it, and he had wonderfully direct brown eyes and a great gentleness and privacy. And I wondered what he looked like now. He had been picked up the evening before on a raid on an apartment downtown for peddling and using heroin. So this is a story about brothers. The main character is Sonny's older brother. They had not gotten along all that well. This guy is 7 years older than his little brother. His little brother has decided to become a musician. That seemed a little dangerous to the older brother who was teaching algebra and thought, no. So they meet after all this, and then they just get to spend one evening together. And I'll just finish. This is the end of the story. It's the end of this day that they spend after. And his little brother is saying, well, I can never tell you. He's explaining what you just heard. You'd explain. I can never tell you, I was all by myself at the bottom of something, stinking and sweating and crying and shaking, and I smelled it, My stink. I thought, I'd die if I couldn't get away from it, and yet at the same time, I knew everything I was doing was just locking me in with it. And I didn't know, he paused, flattening a beer can. I didn't know, I still don't know, something kept telling me that maybe it was good to smell your own stink, but I didn't think that was what I was trying to do, and who can stand it? And he abruptly dropped the ruined beer can, and he looked at me with a small, still smile, and he rose, walking to the window as if it were a lodestone rock, and I watched his face, and he watched the avenue. I couldn't tell you when Mama died, but the reason I wanted to leave Harlem so bad was to get away from drugs. And then when I ran away, that's what I was running from, really. And when I came back, nothing had changed. I hadn't changed, I was just older. And he stopped and he drummed his fingers on the window pane, and the sun had vanished, and soon darkness would fall, and I watched his face. It can come again, he said, almost as though speaking to himself. And then he turned to me. It can come again, he repeated. I just wanted you to know that. All right, I said, so it can come again, all right. He smiled, but the smile was sorrowful. I had to try to tell you, he said. Yeah, I said, I understand that. You're my brother, he said. He looked straight at me, not smiling at all. And I said, yeah, I understand that. And he turned back to the window looking out. All that hatred down there, he said, all that hatred and misery and love, it's a wonder it hasn't blown the avenue apart. So they go on this night together, they go to a nightclub because Sonny is a musician, and he's decided to just show off a little bit to his older brother. And what happens next seems to me to be just a miracle of writing. We went to the only nightclub on a short, dark street downtown. We squeezed through the narrow, chattering, jam-packed bar to the entrance of a big room where the bandstand was, and we stood there for a moment, and the lights were very dim in this room. We couldn't see. And then, hello, boy, said a voice. An enormous black man, much older than Sonny or myself, erupted out of that atmospheric lighting and put an arm around Sonny's shoulder. I'm sitting right here, he said. I'm waiting for you. He had a big voice, and heads in the darkness turned toward us. Sonny grinned and pulled a little away and said, Creole, this is my brother. I told you about him. Creole shook my hand. I'm glad to meet you, son, he said. And it was very clear that he was glad to meet me there for Sonny's sake. And he smiled and said, you got a real musician in your family. And he took his arm from Sonny's shoulder, and he slapped him lightly and affectionately with the back of his hand. Well, now I've heard it all, said a voice behind us. This was another musician, a friend of Sonny's, a coal-black, cheerful-looking man built close to the ground. He immediately began confiding to me at the top of his lungs the most terrible things about Sonny, his teeth gleaming like a lighthouse and his laugh coming up out of him like the beginning of an earthquake. And it turned out that someone at the bar knew Sonny. Actually, almost everyone. Some were musicians working there and nearby or not working. Some were simply hangers-on. Some were there to hear Sonny play. I was introduced to all of them, and they were all very polite to me, but it was clear for them I was only Sonny's brother. Here, I was in Sonny's world, or rather his kingdom, because here it was not even a question. His veins bore royal blood. And they were going to play soon, and Creole installed me by myself at a table in a dark corner, and then I watched them. Creole, the little black man also, and Sonny and the others, and they were all horsing around, standing just below the bandstand. The light from the bandstand spilled out just a little short of them, and watching them laughing and gesturing and moving about, I had the feeling that they nevertheless were being most careful not to step into that circle of light too suddenly. That if they moved into the light too suddenly without thinking, they would perish in flame. Then while I watched one of them, the small black man, moved into the light, crossed the bandstand, and started fooling around with his drums. And then, being funny and being also extremely ceremonious, Creel took Sonny by the arm and led him to the piano. That's Sonny's instrument. A woman's voice called Sonny's name, and a few hands started clapping, and Sonny, being also funny and ceremonious, and so touched, I think, that he could have cried, but neither hiding it nor showing it, riding it like a man, grinned and put both hands to his heart and bowed from the waist. Creel then went to the bass fiddle, and a lean, very bright-skinned brown man jumped up on the bandstand, picked up his horn, so there they were, and the atmosphere on the bandstand and in the room began to change and tighten. Someone stepped up to the microphone, announced them, and there were all kinds of murmurs, and some people at the bar shushed others, and the waitress ran around frantically trying to get in the last orders. Guys and chicks got closer and closer together. The lights on the bandstand on the quartet turned a kind of indigo. And then they all looked different there. Creel looked about him for the last time as though he were making certain that all his chickens were in the coop. And then he jumped, struck the fiddle, and there they were. All I know about music is that not many people ever really hear it. And even then, on the rare occasions when something opens within and music enters, what we mainly hear, or hear corroborated, are personal, private, vanishing evocations. But the man who creates the music, he's hearing something else. He's dealing with a roar rising from the void and imposing order on it as it hits the air. What is evoked in him, then, is of another order, more terrible because it has no words, and triumphant, too, for the same reason. And his triumph, when he triumphs, is ours. I watched Sonny's face. His face was troubled. He was working hard, but he wasn't with it. And I had the feeling that in a way, everybody on the bandstand was waiting for him, both waiting for him and pushing him along. But as I began to watch Creel, I realized it was Creel who held them all back. He had them on a short rein, up there, keeping the beat with his whole body, wailing on the fiddle with his eyes half closed. He was listening to everything, but he was listening to Sonny. He was having a dialogue with Sonny. He wanted Sonny to leave the shoreline and strike out for the deep water. He was Sonny's witness that the deep water and the drowning aren't the same thing. He had been there, he knew, he wanted Sonny to know. He was waiting for Sonny to do things with the keys, which would let Creel know that Sonny was in the water. And while Creel listened, Sonny moved deep within, exactly like somebody in torment. I'd never thought before of how awful the relationship must be between a musician and his instrument. He has to fill it, this instrument, with the breath of his life, his own. And he has to make it do that, and he wants it to do. And the piano is just a piano, after all. It's made not of so much wood and wires, little hammers, big ones, ivory. There's only so much you can do with it. And the only way to find this out is to try to make it do everything. Sonny, as I mentioned, has been in jail, so he hadn't been near a piano for over a year. And he wasn't on much better terms with his life, not the life that stretched before him now. He and the piano stammered, started one way, got scared, stopped, started another way, panicked, marked time, started again. Then seemed to have found a direction, panicked again, got stuck. And the face I saw on Sonny I'd never seen before. Everything had been burned out of it. And at the same time, things usually hidden were being burned in by the fire and the fury of the battle which was occurring in him up there. Yet watching Creel's face as they neared the end of the first set, I had the feeling something had happened, something I hadn't heard. When they finished, there was scattered applause, and then without an instant of warning, Creel started into something else. It was almost sardonic. It was, "Am I Blue?" And as though he commanded, Sonny began to play. And then something began to happen. Creel let out the reins, and the dry, low black man said something awful on the drums, and Creel answered, and the drums talked back. Then the horn insisted, sweet and high, slightly detached perhaps. Creel listened, commenting now, dry, driving, beautiful, calm, old. Then it all came together again. Sonny was part of the family again. I could tell this from his face. He seemed to have found, right there, beneath his fingers, a brand new piano. It seemed that he couldn't get over it. And then for a while, just being happy with Sonny, they seemed to be agreeing with him that a brand new piano was certainly a gas. And then Creole stepped forward to remind them of what they were playing was the blues. And he hit something in all of them. He hit something in me, myself. And the music tightened and deepened. And apprehension began to beat in the air. And Creole began to tell us that the blues, here's what they're about. They're not about anything very new. He and his boys up there were keeping it with the risk of ruin, destruction, madness, and death in order to find new ways to make us listen. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it always must be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's only in the light we've got. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. And this tale, according to that face, that body, those strong hands on those strings, has yet another aspect in every country and a new depth in every generation. Listen, Creole seems to be saying, listen. Now, these are Sonny's blues. He made the little black mass on the drums know it, and the bright brown man on the horn. Creole wasn't trying any longer to get Sonny into the water. He was wishing him Godspeed. And then he stepped back very slowly, filling the air with an immense suggestion that Sonny speak for himself. And then they all gathered around Sonny, and Sonny played. Every now and again, one of them seemed to say, Amen. Sonny's fingers filled the air with life, his life. But that life contained so many others. And Sonny went all the way back. He really began with a spare, flat statement of the opening phrase of the song. Then he began to make it his. It was very beautiful because it wasn't hurried. It was no longer a lament. It seemed to hear with what burning he had made it his, with what burning we had yet to make it ours, how we could cease lamenting. Freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us be free if we would listen. That he would never be free until we did. Yet there was no battle in his face now. I heard what he'd gone through, and what he'd continue to go through, though until he came to rest in the earth, and he had made this his. That long line of which we knew only Mama and Daddy, he was giving it back. Everything must be given back, so that passing through death, it can live forever. So I saw my mother's face again, and I felt for the first time how the stones of the road that she had walked on must have bruised her feet. I saw the moonlight road where my father's brother died, and it brought something else back to me and carried me past it. I saw my little girl again, who had died, and felt Isabel's tears again, that's his wife. I felt my own tears begin to rise, and I was yet aware that this was only a moment, and that the world waited outside as hungry as a tiger, and the troubles stretched above us longer than the sky. And then it was over. Creole and Sonny let out their breath, both soaking wet and grinning. There was a lot of applause. Some of it was real. In the dark, a girl came by, and I asked her to take the drinks to the bandstand. And there was a long pause. And while they talked up there in the indigo light, after a while I saw the girl put a scotch and a glass of milk. He had a thing with his brother about serving a glass of milk. So the glass of milk was sitting there on the piano for Sonny. He didn't seem to notice it. But just before they started playing again, he sipped from it, looked toward me, and nodded. Then he put it back on the top of the piano. And for me then, as they began to play again, that glass of milk glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling.
And now we have our theater troupe. We're going to do sections from Blues from Mr. Charlie, but starting with Wrenn introducing, reading from Baldwin's introduction.
This is entitled Notes for Blues. This play has been on my mind, but has been bugging me for several years. It is unlike anything else I've ever attempted in that I remember vividly the first time it occurred to me. For in fact, it did not occur to me, but to Elia Kazan. Kazan asked me at the end of 1958 if I would be interested in working in the theater. It was a generous offer, but I did not react with great enthusiasm because I did not then and do not now have much respect for what goes on in the American theater. I'm not convinced that it is a theater. It seems to me a series merely of commercial speculations, stale, repetitious, and timid. I certainly didn't see much future for me in that framework, and I was profoundly unwilling to risk my morale and my talent, my life, in endeavors which could only increase the level of frustration already dangerously high. Nevertheless, the germ of the play persisted. It is based, very distantly indeed, on the case of Emmett Till, the Negro youth who was murdered in Mississippi in 1955. The murderer in this case was acquitted. His brother who helped him do the deed is now a deputy sheriff in Rooseville, Mississippi. After his acquittal, he recounted the facts of the murder, for one cannot refer to his performance as a confession, to William Bradford Huey, who wrote it all down in an article called Wolf Whistle. I do not know why the case pressed on my mind so hard, but it would not let me go. I absolutely dreaded committing myself to writing a play. There were enough people around already telling me that I couldn't write novels, but I began to see that my fear of the form masked a much deeper fear. That fear was that I would never be able to draw a valid portrait of the murderer. In life, obviously, such people baffle and terrify me, and with one part of my mind at least, I hate them and would be willing to kill them. Yet with another part of my mind, I am aware that no man is a villain in his own eyes. Something in the man must know that what he is doing is evil, but in order to accept the knowledge, the man would have to change. What is ghastly and really almost hopeless in our racial situation now is that the crimes we have committed are so great and so unspeakable that the acceptance of this knowledge would lead, literally, to madness. The human being then, in order to protect himself, closes his eyes, compulsively repeats his crimes, and enters a spiritual darkness which no one can describe. But if it is true, and I believe it is, that all men are brothers, then we have the duty to try and understand this wretched man. And while we probably cannot hope to liberate him, begin working towards the liberation of his children. For we, the American people, have created him. He is our servant. It is we who put the cattle prodder in his hands, and we are responsible for the crimes that he commits. It is we who have locked him in a prison of his color. It is we who have persuaded him that Negroes are worthless human beings and that it is his sacred duty as a white man to protect the honor and purity of his tribe. It is we who have forbidden him, on pain of exclusion from the tribe, to accept his beginnings when he and black people loved each other and rejoice in them and use them. It is we who have made it mandatory, honorable, that white father should deny black son. These are grave crimes indeed, and we have committed them and continue to commit them in order to make money. The play then, for me, takes place in Plague Town, USA, now. The plague is race. The plague is our concept of Christianity, and this raging plague has the power to destroy every human relationship. I once took a short trip with Medgar Evers to the backwoods of Mississippi. He was investigating the murder of a Negro man by a white storekeeper, which had taken place months before. Many people talked to Medgar that night in dark cabins with their lights out and whispers, and we had been followed for many miles out of Jackson, Mississippi, not by a lunatic with a gun, but by state troopers. I will never forget that night, as I will never forget Medgar, who took me to the plane the next day. We promised to see each other soon. When he died, something entered into me which I cannot describe, but it was then that I resolved that nothing under heaven would prevent me from getting this play done. We are walking in terrible darkness here, and this one man's attempt to bear witness to the reality and the power... We are walking in terrible darkness here, and this is one man's attempt to bear witness to the reality and the power of light. James Baldwin, New York, April 1964.
I hear it was real bad tonight.
Not as bad as it's gonna get. Maybe I was wrong not to let the people armed.
If the Negroes were armed, it's the Negroes who'd be slaughtered. You know that.
They're slaughtered anyway. And I don't know that. I thought I knew it. But now I'm not so sure.
What's come over you? What's going to happen to the people in this town, this church, if you go to pieces?
Maybe they'll find a leader who can lead them someplace.
Somebody with a gun? Is that what you mean?
I'm a Christian. I've been a Christian all my life, like my mom and daddy before me and like their mom and daddy before them. Of course, if you go back far enough, you get to the point before Christ. If you see what I mean, BC. And at that point, I've been thinking black people weren't raised to turn the other cheek in the hope of heaven. No, then they didn't have to take low before Christ. They walked around just as good as anybody else. And when they died, they didn't go to heaven. They went to join their ancestors. My son is dead. But he's not gone to join his ancestors. He was a sinner. So he must have gone to hell if we're going to believe what the Bible said. Is that such an improvement? Such a mighty advance over BC? I've been thinking, I had to think, would I have been such a Christian if I hadn't been born black? Maybe I had to become a Christian in order to have any dignity at all. Since I wasn't a man in men's eyes, then I could be a man in the eyes of God. But that didn't protect my wife. She's dead too soon. We don't really know how. That didn't protect my son. He dead. And we know how too well. That hasn't changed this town. This town where you couldn't find a white Christian at high noon on Sunday. The eyes of God, maybe those eyes are blind. I never let myself think of that before.
Meridian, you can't be the man who gives the signal for the Holocaust.
Well, must I be the man who watches while his people are beaten, chained, starved, clubbed, butchered?
You used to say that your people were all the people in the world. All the people God ever made or would make. You said your race was the human race.
The human race.
I have never seen you like this before. There's something in your tone I have never heard before. Rage, maybe hatred.
Well, you heard it before. You just never recognized it before. You heard it in all those blues, and spirituals, and gospel songs you claim to love so much.
I was talking about you, not your history. I have a history, too. And don't be so sure I've never heard that sound. Maybe I've never heard anything else. Perhaps my life is also hard to bear.
You know, I watched you all this week up at that police chief's office with me, and you know how to handle him because you show you better than he is. But you both have more in common with each other than either of you have with me. And for both of you, and I watched this. Now, I never watched it before. It was just a black boy that was dead, and that was the problem. He saw the problem one way, you saw it another way. But it wasn't a man that was dead. Not my son. And you held yourselves from that.
I may have sounded cold. It was not because I felt cold. There was no other way to sound, Meridian. I took the only tone which, it seemed to me, could accomplish what we wanted. And I do know the chief of police better than you because I'm white. And I can make him listen to me because I am white. And I don't know if I think I'm so much better than he is, but I know what we have done and do. But you must have mercy on us. We have no other hope.
You have never shown us any mercy at all.
Meridian, give me credit for knowing that you're in pain. We are two men, two friends. In spite of all that could divide us, we have come too far together. There is too much at stake for you to become black now and for me to become white. Don't accuse me. Don't accuse me. I didn't do it.
So was my son innocent?
Meridian, when I asked you for mercy a moment ago, I meant, please try to understand that it is not so easy to leap over fences, to give things up, all right, to surrender privilege. But if you were among the privileged, you would know what I mean. It's not a matter of trying to hold on. The things, the privilege are a part of you, are who you are. It's in the gut.
And where's the point of this struggle? Where's the hope if Mr. Charlie can't change?
Who is Mr. Charlie?
You, Mr. Charlie. All white men is Mr. Charlie.
Sound more and more like your son. Do you know that? A lot of the colored people here didn't approve of him. But he said they longed to say, said right out loud for all the world to hear, how much he despised white people.
He didn't say things I longed to say. Maybe it was because he was my son. I didn't care what he felt about white people. I just wanted him to live, to have his own life. There's something you don't understand about being black. Parnell, if you're a black man with a black son, you have to forget all about white people and concentrate on trying to save your son. And that's why I let him stay up north. I was wrong. I failed. Lyle walked him up that road, and he killed him.
We don't know that Lyle killed him, and Lyle denies it.
Of course he denies it. What do you mean we don't know Lyle killed him?
We don't know. All we can say is that it looks that way, and circumstantial evidence is a tricky thing.
When it involves a white man killing a black man, if Lyle didn't kill him, Parnell, who did?
I don't know.
Who killed him?
But we don't know that Lyle did it.
Well, Lyle doesn't deny he killed old Bill.
No.
And we know how Lyle feels about colored people.
Well, yes, from your point of view. But from another point of view, Lyle hasn't got anything against colored people. He just
doesn't think they're human.
Yep, well, even that's not true. He doesn't think they're not human. After all, I know him. He is hot-tempered, and he's far from being the brightest man in the world, but he's not mean. He's not cruel. He's a poor white man. The poor whites have been just as victimized in this part of the world as blacks have ever been.
For God's sake, spare me this historical view, all right? Lyle is responsible for Richard's death.
But Meridian, we can't even in our own minds decide that he's guilty. We have to operate the way justice always has to operate and give him the benefit of the doubt.
What doubt?
Don't you see, Meridian, that now you're operating the way white people in town operate whenever a colored man is on trial?
Well, when was the last time one of us was on trial here, Papa?
That can't have anything to do with it. It can't. We must forget about all of the past injustices. We have to start from scratch, or do our best to start from scratch. It isn't vengeance we're after. Is it?
I don't want vengeance. I don't want to be paid back. Anyway, I couldn't be. I just want Lyle to be made to know that what he did was evil. I just want this town to be forced to face the evil that it countenances and to turn from evil and do good. That's why I've stayed in this town so long.
But if Lyle didn't do it? Lyle's a friend of mine. A strange friend, but a friend. I love him. I know how he suffers.
How does he suffer?
He suffers from being in the dark. Having things inside him that he can't name and can't face and can't control. He's not a wicked man. I know he's not. I've known him almost all his life. The face he turns to you, Meridian, isn't the face he turns to me.
Is the face he turns to you more real than the face he turns to me? You go ask him if he killed my son.
They're going to ask him that in court. That's why I fought to bring about this trial, and he will say no.
I don't care what he says in court. You go ask him. You go ask him if he's your friend. He'll tell you.
No. No, he may not. He's maybe a little afraid of me.
If you're his friend, you'll know whether he's telling you the truth or not. Go ask him.
I can't do it. I'm his friend. I can't betray him.
But you can betray me. You are a white man, aren't you? There's another white man out there.
Even if he says yes, it won't make any difference. The jury will not convict him, ever.
Is that why you fought to bring about this trial? I don't care what the jury does. I know he won't say yes to them. He won't say yes to me. But he might say yes to you. You say we don't know. Well, I got a right to know. And I got a right to ask you to find out, since you're the only man who can find out. And I got to find out. I've got to find out whether we've been friends all these years. Or whether I have been just your favorite Uncle Tom.
Now, you know better than that.
I don't know, Parnell. And along with any of the things I used to know, maybe I never knew them. Listen, I'm tired. Going home.
You don't trust me anymore, do you, Meridian?
Maybe I never trusted you. I don't know. Maybe I never trusted myself. Go home. leave me alone. I got to look back at my record.
Meridian, what you ask, I don't know if I can do it for you.
I don't want you to do it for me. I want you to do it for you. Good night.
Good night.
My record. Would God, I had died for thee, my son. My son.
Strangers in church basements. Am I? Reverend Phelps has been married for more than 20 years. Don't let those thoughts in your citadel. You just remember that the mind is a citadel and you can keep out all troubling thoughts. Ah, Mrs. Evans, you are certainly a sight for sore eyes. I don't know how you manage to look so unruffled and cool and young with all those children. And Mr. Evans, how are you tonight? She has a baby just about every year. I don't know how she stands it. Mr. Evans don't look like that kind of man. You sure can't tell a book by its cover. Lord, I wish I was in my own home, and these were my guests, and my husband was somewhere in the room. I'm getting old maid. Maid. Oh, Mr. Arpino, you taking time out from your engineering to come visit here with us? It sure is a pleasure to have you. My, he is big and dark, like a Greek or a Spaniard. Some people say he might have a touch of nigger blood. I don't believe that. He's just foreign, that's all. He needs a haircut. I wonder if he's got hair like that all over his body. Remember that your mind is a citadel. A citadel. Oh, Lord, I am tired of serving coffee in church basements. I want. Why, good evening, Ellis. And Mr. Lyle Britton. We sure don't see either of you very often. Why, Mr. Britton, you know you don't mean that. You come over here just to see little old me? Why, you just go right ahead and drink that coffee. I do believe you need to be sobered up.
What is your relationship to the accused?
I am his wife.
Will you please tell us, in your own words, of your first meeting with the deceased, Richard Henry?
Well, I was in the store, sitting at the counter, and pretty soon this colored boy come in, loud, and talking in just the most awful way. I didn't recognize him. I just knew he wasn't one of our colored people. His language was something awful.
He was insulting? Was he insulting Mrs. Britton?
He said all kinds of things, dirty things, like, well, just like I might have been a colored girl. That's what it sounded like to me. Just like some little colored girl he might have met on a street corner and wanted to, for a night. And I was scared. I hadn't seen a colored boy act like that before. He acted like he was drunk, crazy, or maybe he was under the influence of that dope. I never knew nobody to be drunk and act like him. His eyes was just going, and he acted like he had a fire in his belly. But I tried to be calm because I didn't want to upset Lyle. You know, Lyle's mighty quick-tempered. And he was working in the back of the store. He was hammering and...
Go on, Mrs. Britton. What happened then?
Well, that boy, wanted to buy him 2 Cokes because he had a friend outside.
He brought a friend. He did not come there alone? Did this other boy enter the store?
No. Not then, he didn't. I give him 2 Cokes, the 2 Cokes, and he tried to grab my hands and pull me to him, and he pushed himself up against me real close and hard, and, oh, he was just like an animal. I could smell him. And he tried to kiss me. He kept whispering these awful, filthy things, and I got scared. I yelled for Lyle.
Then Lyle come running out the back, and when the boy seen I wasn't alone in the store, he yelled for this other boy outside, and this other boy come rushing in, and they both jumped on Lyle and knocked him down.
What made you decide not to report this incident, this unprovoked assault, to the proper authorities, Mrs. Britton?
We've had so much trouble in this town.
Yeah, what sort of trouble, Mrs. Britton?
What? With the colored people. We've got all these northern agitators coming through here all the time and stirring them up so you can't hardly sleep nights.
Then you, as a responsible citizen of this town, were doing your best to keep down trouble? Even though you had been so brutally assaulted by a deranged northern Negro dope addict?
Yes. I didn't want to stir up no more trouble. I made Lyle keep quiet about it. I thought it would all blow over. I knew the boy's daddy was a preacher and that he would talk to the boy about the way he was behaving. It was all over town in a second anyway. And looked like all the colored people was on the side of that crazy boy. And Lyle's always been real good to colored people.
On the evening that the alleged crime was committed, or rather the morning, very early on the morning of the 24th of August, where were you and your husband, Mrs. Britton?
We were home. The next day we heard that the boy was missing.
Doesn't an attempt at sexual assault seem a rather strange thing to do, considering that your store is a public place, with people continually going in and out, that furthermore, it is located on a public road which people use on foot and in automobiles all the time? And considering that your husband, who has the reputation of being a violent man, and who is, in your own words, mighty quick-tempered, was working in the back room?
He didn't know Lyle was back there.
But he knew someone was back there, for according to your testimony, he was hammered.
Well, I told you the boy was crazy. He had to be crazy, or he was on that dope.
You ever hear of a junkie trying to rape anybody?
I didn't say rape.
Were you struggling in Mr. Henry's arms when your husband came out of the back room carrying his hammer in his hand?
No, I was free then.
Now, therefore, your husband had only your word for the alleged attempted assault. You told him that Richard Henry had attempted to assault you, had made sexual advances on you. Please answer, Mrs. Britton.
Yes, I had to tell him. I'm his wife.
And a most loyal one. You told your husband that Richard Henry had attempted to assault you, then begged him to do nothing about it?
That's right.
And though he was under the impression that his wife had been nearly raped by a Negro, he agreed to forgive and forget and do nothing about it? He agreed to neither call the law nor take the law into his own hands?
Yes.
Extraordinary. Mrs. Britton, you are aware that Richard Henry met his death sometime between the hours of 2 and 5 o'clock on the morning of Monday, August 24th.
Yes.
In an earlier statement several months ago, you stated that your husband had spent the night at the store. You now state that he came in before 1 o'clock and went to sleep at once. What accounts for this discrepancy?
It's natural. I made a mistake about the time. I got it mixed up with another night. He spent so many nights at the store.
The witness may step down. You know what that nigger said to me?
I'm ready. Here I am. You asked me if I was ready, didn't you? What's on your mind, white man?
Boy, I always treated you with respect. I don't know what's the matter with you or what makes you act the way you do. But you owe me an apology, and I come out here tonight to get it. I mean, I ain't going away without it.
I owe you an apology? That's a wild idea. What am I apologizing for?
You know, you're mighty lucky to still be walking around.
So are you, white man.
I'd like you to apologize for your behavior in my store that day. Now, I think I'm being pretty reasonable, ain't I?
You got anything to write on? I'll write you an IOU.
You keep it up, you'll be laughing out the other side of your mouth pretty soon.
Why don't you go home and let me go home? Do we need all this shit? Can't we live without it?
Boy, you drunk.
Oh, I ain't drunk. I'm just tired. Tired of all this fighting. What are you trying to prove? What am I trying to prove?
I'm trying to give you a break, but you're too dumb to take it.
I'm here. You've been trying to give me a break for a great long time, but there's only one break I want, and you won't give me that.
What kind of break you want, boy?
For you to go home. And let me go home. I got things to do. I got lots of things to do.
I got things to do, too. I'd like to go home, too.
Well, then why are we standing here? Can't we walk? Let me walk, white man. Let me walk.
We can walk. Just as soon as we get our business done.
It's settled. You a man and I'm a man. Let's walk.
Nigger, you was born down here. Ain't you never said sir to a white man?
No, the only person I ever said sir to was my daddy.
You gonna apologize to me?
Nope.
You wanna live?
Yes.
And you know what you gotta do, don't you?
Go home. Go home.
You facing my gun. Now, in just a minute, we can both go on home.
Sick mother. Why can't you leave me alone? White man, I don't want nothing from you. You ain't got nothing to give me. You can't eat because none of your sad-ass chicks can cook. You can't talk because won't nobody talk to you. You can't dance because you got nobody to dance with. Don't you know I've watched you all my life? All my life. And I know you're women. Don't you think I don't better than you?
Thanks.
Why have you spent so much time trying to kill me, huh? Why are you always trying to cut off my cock? Well, you worried about it? Why? Hey! Okay. You keep your old lady home. You hear? Don't let her near no nigger. She might get to like it. You might get to like it too. Wow. Oh, Juanita! Daddy! Mama!
I had to kill him then. I'm a white man. Can't nobody talk that way to me. I had to go and get my pickup truck and load him in it. I had to carry him on my back and carry him out to the high weeds. And I dumped him in those weeds, face down. And then I come on home to my good Joe here. And I ain't sorry. I ain't sorry.
My heart is heavier tonight than it has ever been before. I raise my voice to you tonight out of sorrow and a wonder I have never felt before. Not only I, my Lord, am in this case, everyone under the sound of my voice, and many more souls than that feel as I feel, and tremble as I tremble, and bleed as I bleed. It is not that the days are dark, or we have seen dark days. It is not only that the blood runs down and no man helps us. It is not only that our children are destroyed before our eyes. It is not only that our lives from day to day and every hour of each day are menaced by the people among whom you have set us down. We have borne all these things, my Lord, and we have done that what the prophets of old could not do. We have sung the Lord's song in a strange land, What was the sin committed by our fathers in that time that has banished us on the other side of the flood, which has had to be expiated by chains, by the lash, by hunger and thirst, by slaughter, by fire, by the rope, by the knife, for so many generations, my Lord, on these wild shores in this strange land. Our offense must have been mighty, our crime immeasurable. But it is not the past which makes our hearts so heavy. It is the present. Lord, where is our hope? Who or what shall touch the hearts of this headlong and unthinking people and turn them back from destruction? When will they hear the words of John? I know thy works, that thou art neither cold nor hot. I would that thou wert cold or hot. So then, because thou art lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. Because thou sayest, I am rich and increased with goods, and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. Now, when the children come, my Lord, and ask which road to follow, my tongue stammers and my heart fails. I will not abandon the land, this strange land, which is my home. My home. But can I ask the children forever to sustain the cruelty inflicted on them by those who have been their masters and who are now, in very truth, their kinfolk, their brothers and their sisters and their parents? What hope is there for a people who deny their deeds and disown their kinsmen and do so in the name of purity and love and in the name of Jesus Christ? What a light, my Lord. What a light is needed to conquer so mighty a darkness. This darkness rules in us and grows in black and white alike. I have set my face against the darkness. I will not let it conquer me, even though it will, I know, one day destroy this body. But my Lord, for the children, what shall I tell the children? I must be with you, Lord, like Jacob, and wrestle with you until the light appears. I will not let you go until you give me a sign that in the terrible Sahara of our time, a fountain may spring, the fountain of a true morality, and bring us closer, oh my Lord, to that peace on earth desired by so few throughout so many ages. Let not our suffering endure forever. Teach us to trust the great gift of life and learn to love one another and dare to walk the earth like men. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, all of you. So that was the first session of Baldwin 101. We meet again tomorrow at noon for more. But let's thank all of them.